Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Revolution 250 podcast. Revolution 250 is a consortium of about 70 organizations in and around Massachusetts looking at ways to commemorate the 250th anniversaries of American independence. And I am Bob Allison, the chair of the Rev 250 advisory group, also the chair of the Department of History, Language, and Global Culture at Suffolk University. And I am delighted to have today as our guest, Virginia DeJohn Anderson from the University of Colorado. Virginia, welcome.
Oh, well, thank you, Bob.
And Virginia Anderson is actually one of the foremost historians of the 17th century. She's written a couple of great books that I'll talk about in a minute. But we're here today to talk about her most recent book, The Martyr and the Traitor, Nathan Hale, Moses Dunbar, and the American Revolution. And we're turning our attention today to Connecticut, which is Professor Anderson's native state, and also the home state of the two title characters, Moses Dunbar, about whom I suspect few of us have heard, and Nathan Hale, about whom I hope all of us know at least one thing. So thank you for writing the book. And what brought you to the story? What can you tell us about these two characters, Moses Dunbar and Nathan Hale?
Well, the whole project is a result of serendipity. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Connecticut, I took a course on the American Revolution and wrote about anti-loyalist legislation in Connecticut, a scintillating topic. But in the process of working on that, I found that many of the sources I used would have a footnote that mentioned that Moses Dunbar was the only loyalist executed in the state convicted by a civil court. There were a few courts martial, and executed. And they never explained why he was the only one. And that just sort of stuck in my head from my undergraduate years, through graduate school, through my first couple of books when I was working on other projects. And then finally I thought, you know what? I want to go find out why Moses Dunbar was the only one executed. And in the process of conceiving of the project, to try to figure out what would draw a farm boy, because he's just, that's essentially what he is, comes from a hardscrabble farming family, what would draw him into the loyalist side? I thought it might be more interesting if we're looking at motivations to pair him with a person who took the other side. And I will say, for narrative purposes, to get two men who are hanged sort of make the story a nice parallel. So I came into the book through Dunbar, but also found the Hale story equally compelling, although in a different way.
It really is. And they're very different. And it should, I think, upset some of our notions about who the loyalists are. You mentioned Moses Dunbar as hard scrabble, which may be putting his life is too easy, just saying it's hard scrabble. It's like one misfortune after another.
Right. Well, his father strained to get a family going. I mean, part of the problem with the Dunbar family is the men tended to marry in their teens because they had to. And so getting an estate was a long drawn out process, and they had big families as well. Moses was the eldest son of his natal family. And part of the problem there is his father was already strained for resources, but then Moses alienated his father right after he got married by joining the Anglican Church, which is his father was a staunch Congregationalist and just didn't like this. And so gave him very little help. So Moses, again, he gets a little bit of land, but I suspect he's working for other people and trying to put a living together. And then he marries at 17 and starts having children right away. It's not a life plan that leads to success.
No. What do you think drew him to the Anglican Church?
That's, I wish he had written about it. He says for good and rational reasons. Well, okay. My suspicion is it's linked in part to the fact that his wife had Anglican connections through her mother's side of the family. The Anglican Church, the Congregationalist Church in Dunbar's community was riven by controversy and disputes. The minister was very divisive, and I think the the conflict in the congregation wasn't satisfying his religious needs. And the Anglican Church, the minister of the church when he began was a guy named James Scoville, who, from what I can tell, was a very kind and nurturing man. And I think between the sort of marital family connection and the nature of the Anglican Church in his community, it just seemed like a more congenial place for him.
So the perception that I think might be out there about this schism is that the Anglicans tended to be upper class folks and the Congregationalists less so, but you really show that that's not the case for these folks who were drawn to Anglicanism in Connecticut.
No, I mean, there were some wealthy Anglicans in Connecticut, but at least the ones in the community that Dunbar is in are poor. They're young and poor at the time. And one of the things I often have to remind people of is Anglicanism itself is not create a predisposition to loyalism because George Washington was an Anglican.
That's true, yeah.
The context is in Connecticut, or New England in general, but in Connecticut, it's this Puritan heritage. It's the people who had come to the New World to get away from the Anglican Church. So it has a different kind of meaning in New England than it does in other colonies where the Church of England is the established church.
So how does he wind up being hanged? Can you tell us what leads to that?
Part of it is that as the revolutionary crisis gains momentum, Dunbar apparently makes little speeches about his support for the British. And as conflict approached, when we were getting close to when the war was going to be breaking out, a lot of people who were on the other side saw him as increasingly dangerous. And one of the things that struck me in looking at the context of Dunbar's experience was how the people who we normally think of as the heroes of the revolution, these revolutionary committees who are pushing for eventually independence from Britain, are in fact acting like mobs. They're going after Anglicans, beating them up. Dunbar was beaten up by a mob. He says his life was almost taken away. And so in that context, once the war begins, he sees that he's not going to be safe in the community. So once the British take New York in August of 1776, he realizes that he has an avenue to safety, which is to go over to New York, or in his case, Long Island, and join a loyalist regiment. And then he goes back to Connecticut to recruit other loyalists, and he's captured at a time when there's a law in the books in Connecticut that says doing what he did is a capital offense.
Wow. So now you said he was the only one executed in Connecticut, and why was he the only one?
I think that it was in part because this is all happening at a moment when everybody thinks Britain's going to win. There are the British in New York, Connecticut's right next door. And Connecticut was desperate to show that these laws that they just passed, the assembly had just passed, meant something. There's Dunbar, a guy who is alienated from his own community, who has very few friends, and the friends he has are Anglicans who can't help him. He's the perfect test case to show that this newly sovereign, independent state of Connecticut can execute somebody. And once they've done it, they don't have to keep doing it. And particularly, I think the other context is the war began shortly thereafter, moving south, moving to Philadelphia, moving to the south, so that imminent danger had receded.
Okay. And he leaves behind, he's married again. His first wife had died. He's married again, and his wife, also a teenager, she's a teenager, he's about 30, is pregnant. And was she actually there at the execution? You have her there.
Yeah, there's one eyewitness account who's a Massachusetts soldier who's passing through Connecticut. And this is great when I found this. This gives me some sense of what the whole process was like. And he mentions that Dunbar's wife was there, pregnant.
Wow. And then he had written like a final statement and a letter to his children. Now, you say they never saw them, they weren't delivered, but then about 100 years later, they surfaced. That's an interesting story about these, how he comes back into a bit of memory. I think your book has done more than the documents did.
Yeah, I mean, everybody after was trying to forget him because he was on the wrong side. But these documents did emerge, and what was frustrating to me is there's no original of either of these documents. In fact, I never even saw a contemporary copy of the letter to the children, but it's mentioned in a number of sources, and it's the same kind of wording. So I'm pretty sure that he did do that. And the final statement, or his dying statement, I found in the Morgan Library in New York what looks to me like a late 18th century copy. They were not able to help me with provenance, where this came from, but it looks pretty authentic. It's definitely an 18th century copy, and it seems to have been likely in the hand of Dunbar's son-in-law, and then it was just hidden away in this house in Harwinton, Connecticut.
Wow. And then he has two brothers who fight on the other side.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And in fact, one of his brothers enlists right after his older brother is hanged, just to say, we're, the rest of us Dunbars are on the right side. Don't come after us.
Wow.
And both those Continental Army veterans come to a bad end. I mean, they're impoverished. They seek a pension afterwards. They have nothing to their name. And they both suffered partial blindness from smallpox that they got in the Army.
Wow. Now, Nathan Hale, though, is a character we all know. And it's interesting that he is executed in the fall of 1776 in Dunbar in early 1777. And Hale, you make the point, it's not immediately that he becomes a hero, because there was this idea he was doing something dishonorable by spying.
Right. I mean, you're pretending to be something you aren't. And that's why when George Washington desperately wanted somebody to go spy on the British, he had to get a volunteer. Couldn't ask somebody to do a dishonorable act. Yeah.
Now, Hale is an officer in Washington's army at the time.
Yes. He's a captain.
Yeah, and so he had been in the siege of Boston. He according to your book, he's really looking for a chance to distinguish himself, and so all he's doing as in the siege of Boston is holding on. And he sees this. Can you tell us a little bit about the spying expedition? What he's trying to do?
Well, again, it's right after the British have taken New York, and he was also around for the Battle of New York, and around just before he engages in this spying mission, he joined a troop of Rangers, Captain Thomas Knowlton's Rangers. And these are guys who were selected, who are supposed to be pretty wise and yet intrepid, to go out and do reconnaissance and things like that. And so Hale had joined Knowlton's Rangers, and when Washington needed somebody to undertake the spying mission, there was Nathan Hale, 21 years old, me, thinking he could do great things. And, what's interesting is that his ruse was that he was going to dress up as a school teacher. And he'd already been teaching school. That's what he did before he joined the Army. And then carry his Yale diploma, go down to New York and pretend that he was just looking for a job. When he saw what was going on in the British camp, he took notes. He wrote them in Latin, which he figured none of the rubes in New York would be able to read, stuffed the notes in his shoe. But then when he was heading back to Connecticut with this precious information, he screwed up and got caught.
Yeah. Wow. So we're talking with Virginia DeJohn Anderson, the author of The Martyr and the Traitor, Nathan Hale, Moses Dunbar, and the American Revolution, which is a great book looking at these two characters and the revolution they're both involved in on different sides, actually in the very early stages of it. So it's a terrific book. So Hale, though, he's I don't know, would you say that these guys are somehow representative of folks in Connecticut at this time in different ways?
It's hard to say. In ways, I would say Dunbar is a little more representative of a certain sort of poor Anglican
Yeah.
in Western Connecticut. Hale it's hard to call him typical because he's college educated.
Yeah.
And only a tiny proportion of, Connecticut people were college educated. So that really raised him in a different level, although he comes from a family that's a prosperous farming family. I mean, he had, I think, two other brothers who went to Yale, but the others became farmers.
Yeah.
And craftsmen.
Yeah. And then at Yale, he's involved in this group, the Linonians, which are trying to upset trying to do more than simply the states. I guess you and I can talk freely about Yale and its stodgy curriculum. Yes. Can you tell us a bit about this group? This kind of an interesting group of young intellectuals.
Right. So these I'm sorry to say kids because I've been teaching college my whole life. They're kids. Yale's 14 when he first goes to Yale. The curriculum is pretty rigid. Theology, foreign, ancient languages, and so on. But what they want is education in literature. The sort of contemporary essays and so on. And they can't get it through the curriculum. The Yale Corporation says no, that's nonsense. And so they formed this Linonian Society. It's actually formed about 20 years before Nathan Hale was there, where this is a club. It's a literary club, and they're going to get together and they're going to read these things that they're not allowed to read as part of the curriculum. They're going to meet once a week and give speeches to each other, engage in debates, put on plays, all this sort of stuff. But what I argue in the book, which is interesting, and I think it's a piece of Hale's background that the typical person who only knows about his final words doesn't see, is what they're trying to do is gain the sort of polish and gloss of genteel English, gentlemen.
Yes.
And so they're trying to be English as much as anything else through this Linonian Society.
Yeah. And I think you and I love it when undergraduates demand more humanities in the curriculum.
I wish they would do more of it.
That's right. That's right. We're hoping that they will form groups at our colleges. And then, I mean, putting on plays, that was really a dicey thing in New England at the time. It's forbidden to put on plays, I know, in Massachusetts and in Connecticut. So what kind of plays are they putting on? What's that?
Mainly British comedies. And what's interesting to me is the rules of the Yale Corporation. I mean, the rules that students were supposed to abide by specifically say, no, you're not even supposed to go to a play. You're not supposed to act in one. Young men are not supposed to dress up in women's clothing. And they're doing all of this, including the son of Yale's president is involved in this.
Yeah, I mean, there must be another story there. That's such a great scene with these kids doing all of this, which is so much against the rules. And to us, of course, this looks like what you should be doing in college. And so it's really intriguing. And then this group, it includes some people who do have some prominence later. And so how much of it, again, it's hard to tell with Hale because he doesn't leave behind a memoir about what he's doing. And you make the point that we wouldn't know anything about him had people not saved his various scraps of paper that he had written. But you've done a terrific job of reconstructing him from the evidence that you've been able to find. So,
I mean, part of it is too when these Yale students graduated, they were distraught at losing contact with each other. And so at the last Linonian anniversary celebration, they implored each other to keep writing and to make sure their letters were polished and grammatical and really emphasize the importance of friendship. And that was the spur to them to keep writing. And there are many more letters to Yale or to Hale that have survived than ones he wrote because he saved them. And when you read them, you can sometimes see what he's responding to. So what they're responding to. So what he must have said that made this correspondent say something back.
So we're talking with Virginia DeJohn Anderson, author of The Martyr and The Traitor. And what's really astonishing to me about Hale is he only lives to be about 21 years old. So he has this life, and he leaves Yale and goes off to teach school in a small town in East Haddam, and then winds up in New London, which was a bigger metropolis at the time. And so what draws him into the army when the war starts?
This sort of leads to one of the bigger points that I try to make in the book, which is that looking at the revolution at the sort of ground level here, as I tried to do in this book, you get to see how important personal connections were to people making their political decisions. It's not that they're all reading learned pamphlets and, with their intellectual justification for whichever position they took. I'm not saying they never did that, but with Hale, he's a couple of things. When he's teaching school in New London, his patrons there are all ardent Whigs. And I suspect he's listening to them and following their lead. But also as far as joining the army, because you can support the revolution, that's one thing, but to join the army is another step beyond that, is some of the letters he's getting are informing him that his classmates are joining. And because they're college graduates, they can enter the army and become officers, junior officers right off the bat. And so I think in part, he wants to do what his friends are doing. The other thing is, everybody at this time, this is the end of 1775, they think this revolution is going to be over in a couple of months, and it's an adventure. So, when he joins, and then when he travels up to the outskirts of Boston for the siege of Boston, a whole bunch of his college friends are there, so he can kind of reconstitute his college group, at least partially, through the army. And plus, you're no longer in a relatively small town or small city in Connecticut. You're now part of this much bigger group of mainly young people. So and you can try to impress your superior officers and do all those sorts of things.
And he does impress his superior officers. He really studies the manuals and does other things that it's...
And the fact that 40 plus years after he died, there's evidence that people who, from these petitions for people trying to get pensions, people will say, I was in the army, outside of Boston, and I served with Captain Hale, who was executed. So he had an impression on his own men that endured.
But then you make the point that it's a little later that the myth kind of develops about him, or that he becomes a popular hero. I mean, you make a lot of really interesting points about the mythology that develops. And again, we should, before we get to the mythology, we should talk a little bit about his a really famous statement he makes when he is about to be hanged, and you make the point, this is very much like what he had been doing in college, that is a performance, but he's really imbued with, of course, he ends with an allusion to the great play of the time, Cato. Can you want to tell us about this scene?
I mean, again, here's this 21-year-old guy trying to figure out, what am I going to say? He's got a chance to, make one more statement. His audience is going to be probably a handful of officers, and they, would probably have a few enlisted men just observe this as witnesses to this execution. And so what he chooses, and apparently there are a couple of comments that contemporary witnesses that suggest he did say something like this. I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. That he's paraphrasing this phrase from this famous play, which for the Americans had taken on a kind of revolutionary implication that it signified the resistance to tyranny. And yet it was a play that was extraordinarily popular in England at the time. And so the British officers who were listening to this would all have been gentlemen. And they would have known exactly where this came from. So what I tried to suggest is, in picking this particular phrase, what Hale is doing is appealing to the common gentility he shares with these officers, even as he's announcing his revolutionary loyalties.
It's an extraordinary thing to have that kind of presence of mind.
At 21, yeah.
Yeah. And then there is a kind of later on in the 19th century, a mythologizing of him. I mean, it takes a long time to build a monument in his hometown, but now you mentioned how many statues there are. Actually, there's a Nathan Hale school here in Roxbury, Mass, which is the hometown of Joseph Warren. So he becomes more of a popular figure later on in the 19th century.
Yeah. And here again, it's where social networks help explain this, because again, because spying was dishonorable, his family didn't want to celebrate him, and I mean, they wanted to commemorate him. They were grieving.
Yeah.
But after the war ends, his college roommates try to get something going to commemorate him, but it doesn't really gain any traction after the war. There was this kind of sense in which no single individual should be celebrated as part of this revolution. It was a people's war. You could celebrate Washington, you could celebrate Joseph Warren, but only a handful of people. And so that kind of cultural context diminishes any kind of particular enthusiasm for celebrating him until really the early 19th century, when it becomes clear that revolutionary veterans are all dying off. It's like the greatest generation now. And so we better find out about them when we can. And there's more of an interest in the common soldier, which is what Hale was. I mean, he's an officer, a captain. And his family and his friends and the town of Coventry, Connecticut, really are able to accomplish this 70 plus years after he died. He's not really well known until then.
No, that's interesting. We're talking with Virginia DeJohn Anderson from the University of Colorado about her book, The Martyr and the Traitor, about Nathan Hale and Moses Dunbar. Then you mentioned there are two statues of him now in New Haven, and there's one at the CIA headquarters. So it is.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic that a failed spy is like the patron saint of the CIA. I don't want to go any further with that.
I think we can leave that one where it is. So these two interesting characters, Dunbar and Hale, and I guess you make the point there's probably not going to be a movement to build a statue to poor Moses Dunbar or memorialize him. Did you come out of this liking either of these guys more than you thought you would?
I actually came out sort of admiring Hale more than I thought I would, just because of his presence of mind at the end.
Yeah.
Dunbar, he was my entry into the book, and I really kind of sympathized with him in ways that I hadn't expected, because he really got caught up in events that he couldn't control, and he was just trying to, he maybe should have kept his mouth shut earlier.
Yeah.
Trying to, support his family. He's trying to stay with his church, and he can't do it. He can't do it because a war has started, and he's been labeled an enemy. Right.
Yeah. And do we have any idea what happens to his family afterwards? I mean, his wife, his children.
His wife remarries his brother-in-law, the brother of Dunbar's first wife.
Wow.
And I tried to trace Dunbar's children. Some of the sons went to the Midwest. His daughter Bede stayed in Harwinton, Connecticut. She married. I can track her in a couple of the censuses, and then she just kind of disappears. And the child that Esther was carrying at the time of Moses' execution, I found a few Moses Dunbars in the census. I suspect this one in New London may have been his grandson, but I can't know for sure. So I end up with sort of speculating on that.
Right. It's a puzzle you're trying to put together, just trying to figure out this world. And it's a fascinating, really a fascinating world. As you say, the more we get into the revolution, the more complicated it becomes, and the less we really understand it. So now I meant to talk more about some of your earlier work too, because you did something in transforming the way we think about the 17th century and looking at the role of animals and livestock.
Yes.
Creatures of Empire, your book from Oxford University Press, but also your article about King Philip's herds and the precipitating event in King Philip's War. I wonder how you got onto that as a subject.
The creatures of Empire. I always joke that so I went to the University of Connecticut, which has an agricultural school, and so I studied smelling manure in the fields behind my dorm.
Wow.
But I was going to write a history of agriculture in New England. And as I began doing research, I kept seeing the importance of livestock over crops. And then the more I was looking for stuff on livestock, it was often in the context of disputes with Indians. And so eventually the light bulb went off over my head, and I thought, that's the story, not an agricultural history, but the way in which the importation of livestock from England shaped relations with Indians. And so I did New England and the Chesapeake area in that book.
Yeah, wow. So we've been talking with Virginia DeJohn Anderson, author of The Martyr and The Traitor. Anything else we should talk about, Virginia, before we let you go?
I can't think of anything.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's been fun talking to you. I recommend the book, The Martyr and The Traitor. And thank you all for joining us on the Rev 250 podcast. And now we will be piped out on the road to Boston. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.